He was a father who lost his daughter. But to the world, John Ramsey became something else. Entirely. A suspect, a villain, a mystery. In the court of public opinion, grief was never enough to prove innocence. John Ramsey carried the presence of a man shaped by success, but softened by the quiet charm of Boulder, a town where wealth wore hiking boots instead of mink coats. Boulder was a beautiful, serene place, far removed from the world of high-stakes business where John had built his fortune. To outsiders, the Ramsey family appeared to have it all: financial security, social prominence, and a picture-perfect family life. But beneath that polished surface, shadows lingered. Shadows that would come to light on a cold December morning, when John Ramsey made a discovery that would change his life forever. It was John who found her. John Bent, his 6-year-old daughter, lifeless in the basement of their home. He picked her up, held her close. In that moment, perhaps out of instinct, perhaps out of disbelief, he unknowingly altered the crime scene forever. Yet, despite his actions, investigators cast their gaze more sharply on Patsy and Burke. John, in contrast, was seen by many as the grieving father, the pillar of a shattered household. But was that really the full truth? Or did John Ramsey know more than he ever let on? Long before tragedy struck, John Ramsey's life seemed defined by achievement. Born in Lincoln, Nebraska, he forged a successful path through Michigan State University, earning a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering in 1966 and an MBA in 1971. His early career took him into the U.S. Navy's Civil Engineer Corps, with deployments to the Philippines and years in the reserves. Beyond business, he was a man of passions, an accomplished pilot who owned 2 private planes, the son of a decorated WWII pilot, raised with a strong work ethic and quiet discipline. John's personal life was marked by both joy and complexity. His first marriage to Lucinda, Pash in 1966, brought 3 children, Elizabeth, Melinda, and John Andrew, before ending in divorce in 1978. In 1980, he married Patsy Ramsey, a former beauty queen, and together, they welcomed Burke and John Bent into the world, creating a blended family that seemed, outwardly, picture-perfect. By the mid-1990s, John was at the peak of his career. As the founder and CEO of Access Graphics, later a subsidiary of Lockheed Martin, his company generated over $1 billion in six-penny-dashly annual revenue. He was named Entrepreneur of the Year by the Boulder Chamber of Commerce, his personal wealth exceeding $6 million. Just weeks before Christmas 1996, he received a $118,000 bonus, a detail that would later resurface in haunting circumstances. But John was more than a businessman. He was a father who encouraged John Bent's participation in child beauty pageants, a fixture at church, and a familiar face in Boulder's close-knit community. He attended pageants, watched his daughter perform, and spent the Oddities holiday season hosting gatherings with friends and family. The days leading up to Christmas 1996 were filled with joy. On the 23rd of December, the Ramseys hosted a lively holiday party at their home. Friends, neighbors, and fellow parishioners gathered as children built gingerbread houses, and a Santa impersonator brought holiday cheer. Patsy gifted John Bent a gold bracelet engraved with her name, and the date 12 divided by 25 divided by 96 meant as a Christmas gift, but proudly worn early by John Bent that night, paired with a black and white outfit. Later that evening, the family attended a second party at the home of Fleet and Priscilla White, mingling with Boulder's most prominent families. Behind the celebrations, plans for a family trip to Charlevoix, Michigan, were already in motion. John, a skilled pilot, had arranged to fly his family to their lakeside vacation home, where they would reunite with his older children for the holidays. It was the kind of life people envied, prosperous, vibrant, fulfilled, but beneath the surface, no one could see the storm that was coming. These snapshots of success in family life were soon eclipsed by a crime that would captivate and divide the nation. Because in the early hours after Christmas, everything changed. And so began a story that still has no ending. A story of wealth, power, grief, and suspicion, wrapped in unanswered questions. To this day, the question lingers. Was John Ramsey merely the broken father, shattered by unimaginable loss? Or was there something more, something hidden, something never uncovered, waiting in the silence that followed his daughter's final Christmas? Guests at the Ramsey Christmas party included R.A. Brown, Priscilla White's parents, and Cliff Gaston, a friend of the Whites, among others. As the host, John Ramsey likely greeted and mingled with his guests, though no specific actions of his were officially noted. That evening, at 6:48 p.m., a strange 911 call was placed from the Ramsey home, but was quickly disconnected before anyone spoke. When police tried to call back, they reached voicemail. An officer was sent to the house, where family friend Susan Stein explained that the call may have been an accidental dial, possibly linked to an issue with medication for an elderly relative. No further investigation was made, and the officer left by 7:09 p.m. On Christmas Day, the 25th of December, the Ramsey family celebrated quietly at home. John Bent received a new bicycle, and the family spent the day opening presents and sharing holiday meals. That night, John was seen carrying John Bent to bed after the festivities. Some reports suggest that John Bent may have eaten pineapple later that evening, though there is no confirmed evidence placing John Ramsey at the center of this detail. In the early hours of the 26th of December, 1996, the Ramsey household woke to chaos. Around 5:30 a.m., Patsy Ramsey got up to make coffee as the family was preparing for a flight to their vacation home in Charlevoix, Michigan. John, a licensed pilot, was planning to fly them there in his private plane. Shortly after, Patsy went to wake John Bent but discovered that her bed was empty. Alarmed, she soon found a 3-page ransom note left on the back staircase. The note, written on paper from inside their home, demanded a sum of $118,000, the exact amount of John's recent Christmas bonus from Access Graphics, and claimed John Bent had been kidnapped. Patsy quickly woke John, who read the note. Together, they searched the house but found no sign of John Bent. They checked on Burke, who was still asleep in his room. At 5:52 a.m., Patsy made a frantic 911 call, reporting the kidnapping and the ransom note. The call itself has drawn much attention. From the beginning, Patsy's words seemed unusual for a mother in crisis. Instead of explaining the emergency, she first gave her address. This could have been to speed up police response, but some think it sounded rehearsed. She then said, "We have a kidnapping," without clearly saying who had been taken. Her use of "we" instead of "I" distanced her from the situation emotionally, creating a sense of detachment. Throughout the call, Patsy talked more about the ransom note than her missing daughter. She didn't express fear for John Bent's safety, nor did she ask for advice on what to do. Strangely, she never mentioned the kidnapper's warning not to call the police, something a terrified parent might have said. She also used polite words like "please" repeatedly, which can sometimes signal someone trying too hard to sound cooperative. Her responses, at times, seem more like reciting facts than showing real panic. Interestingly, when asked certain factual questions, Patsy responded with "I don't know," which could reflect honesty, since people lying often avoid admitting they don't know something. Still, her emotional distance and unusual wording raised doubts. Perhaps most troubling, after Patsy thought the call had ended, the phone line remained open. In the background, the recording captured what sounded like an argument between several people, something that added even more questions to this already confusing case. In the moments after Patsy hung up the 911 call, the phone line stayed open, capturing voices in the background. One voice, believed to be John Ramsey, was heard saying, "We're not speaking to you," while another voice, thought to be Patsy, asked repeatedly, "What did you do?" Many believe these comments were directed at their son, Burke, who the Ramseys had said was asleep the whole time. This unexpected exchange raised serious doubts about the Bretains and family's earlier claims and suggested possible tension or conflict behind the scenes. Although it's clear that Patsy made the 911 call, the true purpose of that call remains unclear. Was it a genuine plea for help, or was it an attempt to control the situation and shape the W story? After Patsy's call at 5:52 a.m., police arrived at the Ramsey home. John Ramsey cooperated at first, explaining the ransom note and what they knew so far. But instead of keeping the scene private, He called close friends, including Fleet and Priscilla White, to the house for support. The Whites and other friends moved freely around the home before it was secured as a crime scene. This raised suspicions because the ransom note clearly warned the family not to speak to anyone. Investigators and journalists questioned whether John deliberately allowed his friends to contaminate the scene, though no direct proof supports this theory. Some friends even cleaned the kitchen and handled household items, which could have accidentally destroyed evidence. Some believe these actions reflected panic rather than a cover-up. Throughout the morning, John participated in a limited search of the house, but police focused mostly on John Bentee's bedroom and failed to fully search the basement. Little is known about John's exact movements between 6 a.m. and noon. Some investigators thought his lack of urgency was unusual for a father of a missing child, but it could also be explained by shock or by following police instructions. Kim Archuleta, the 911 dispatcher, later said in a CBS interview that John seemed much calmer than Patsy when officers first arrived, behavior some found strange under the Potomac circumstances. But others argued this calmness fit John's personality as a composed businessman and didn't necessarily mean guilt. At around 1 p.m., Detective Linda Arndt, the lead officer at the scene, asked John and Fleet White to search the house once more for anything unusual. They went straight to the basement. John opened a small storage room where Christmas decorations were kept, and there he found John Bentee's body. She was lying on the floor, covered with a white blanket, duct tape over her mouth, and a garrote around her neck. In a moment of shock and grief, John tore the tape from her mouth, picked up her body, and carried her upstairs. He placed her near the Christmas tree, crying out in distress. However, investigators found this deeply suspicious. By moving her, John disturbed the crime scene, potentially destroying key evidence like fingerprints, the body's original position, and DNA on the tape. Detective Arndt later said, in a 1999 Good Morning America interview, that she exchanged a silent look with John in that moment, and that it left her believing he was somehow involved. Though this was only her personal impression, the fact that John went straight to the body raised questions. Some investigators suggested he may have already known where John Bent was hidden. But again, there is no clear evidence to prove this theory. Others argued his reaction was simply that of a distraught father, overwhelmed by finding his child in such a terrible state. At the heart of the John Bent Ramsey case is a complex set of clues that has fueled years of debate. Some point to the Ramseys, while others believe an unknown intruder was responsible. One of the key pieces of evidence is the ransom note, found by Patsy around 5:45 a.m. that morning, written on paper from inside their own home. The ransom note left behind in the Ramsey home remains one of the most puzzling pieces of evidence in the case. Demanding exactly $118,000, the same amount as John Ramsey's recent Christmas bonus, the note was filled with strange, dramatic language, almost like lines from a movie script. Its length and tone were highly unusual for a kidnapping note, leading FBI analysts to conclude it was likely written by someone familiar with the family. Handwriting tests were inconclusive for Patsy Ramsey. She couldn't be ruled out as the author, but John and Burke Ramsey were excluded. The fact that the note was written using paper and pens from inside the house, and that no kidnappers ever called again, led many to suspect the note was staged. While Patsy remained a key person of interest, some still argued that an intruder could have written the note after sneaking into the house. When John Ramsey found John Bentee's body in the basement wine cellar at around 1 p.m. on the 26th of December, the investigation took a dark turn. The autopsy revealed she had been strangled with a homemade garrote fashioned from one of Patsy's paintbrushes and suffered a severe skull fracture. There were also signs of possible sexual assault, including vaginal abrasions and blood, but no clear evidence of semen, leaving the motive uncertain. Her body was partially covered with a white blanket and placed in a little-used basement room, details that suggested the killer knew the house well. Yet, the way the body was left didn't match what would typically be expected from a grieving parent staging a scene to cover their guilt. This opened the door to the theory of an intruder. Another clue, the pineapple. John Bentee's autopsy showed undigested pineapple in her stomach, meaning she likely ate it just a few hours before her death. sometime between 10 o'clock p.m. and 2 a.m. But John and Patsy had claimed she didn't eat anything that night. In the kitchen, police found a bowl of pineapple with Burke Ramsey's fingerprints on it. The timing and meaning of this remain unclear, but some wondered if Burke knew more than he let on. John's decision to move JonBenté's body upstairs and remove the duct tape from her mouth damaged the crime scene, frustrating investigators like Detective Linda Arndt. But was this an emotional father reacting in shock, or someone trying to control the narrative? Other evidence pointed toward an outside intruder. The complex construction of the garrote and the evidence of sexual assault suggested a calculated attack. Most significantly, unidentified male DNA was found on JonBenté's underwear, long johns, and under her fingernails. This DNA didn't match anyone in the Ramsey family or anyone in national criminal databases as of 2003. In 2008, District Attorney Mary Lacey publicly cleared the Ramseys, citing this DNA as proof they were not responsible. Experts like Candace DeLong and forensic scientist Lawrence Kobylinski believe this DNA likely belongs to the killer. However, others, like Michael Baden, argued it could be contamination from the factory where JonBenté's clothing was made. In 2024, John Ramsey called for advanced genealogical DNA testing in hopes of finally identifying the unknown male. This mystery DNA keeps the intruder theory alive, though no suspect has ever been confirmed. Physical clues in the basement also fueled debate. A broken window and an old suitcase. Beneath it could have provided an entry point, as argued by investigator Lou Smith. But spiderwebs across the window frame suggested it hadn't been used recently. John himself admitted breaking the window earlier when locked out of the house, muddying the timeline. A boot print found in the basement and an unidentified Caucasian pubic hair on the blanket further supported the idea of an outsider, but again, no clear link to a suspect was ever made. Other confusing evidence included a rope found in a spare bedroom, which the Ramseys said they didn't own, and a flashlight on the kitchen counter that may have caused JonBenté's head injury. However, neither had any identifiable blood or fingerprints. Possible stun gun marks on JonBenté's body, supported by some investigators but disputed by others, suggested a professional tool was used, pointing toward an intruder, but no stun gun was ever found. The 911 call placed by Patsy Ramsey at 5:52 a.m. introduced even more doubts. Enhanced analysis of the call's background audio picked up voices resembling Burke's, despite claims he was asleep through the whole ordeal. Patsy's phrasing, using words like gone and missing instead of kidnapped, was flagged by some experts as evasive language. John's calm demeanor when police arrived also raised eyebrows, though others argued it fit his personality as a composed businessman. Despite the Ramsey family's close connection to nearly every key piece of evidence, there has never been enough proof to charge them. John Ramsey, in particular, remains central to the story. He discovered the body, disturbed the crime scene, and his Christmas bonus was specifically mentioned in the ransom note. Yet, handwriting analysis excluded him as the author, and the foreign DNA on JonBenté's clothing did not match him. His actions, while strange, could be explained by emotional shock rather than guilt. Still, red flags persist. Detective Linda Arndt, the first officer on the scene, later said she felt uneasy about John from the start. For her, the way he carried JonBenté's body from the POF basement wasn't just the act of a grieving father. It was part of a pattern of behavior that made her question everything. In the end, the evidence against John Ramsey is circumstantial and incomplete. He is tangled in nearly every part of the case, yet no piece of proof has ever been enough to fully implicate him. Whether he was an innocent father caught in a nightmare or someone hiding a terrible truth remains one of America's greatest unsolved mysteries. One of the most haunting moments in the JonBenté Ramsey investigation centers on how John Ramsey carried his daughter's lifeless body. Detective Linda Arndt, the first investigator on the scene, described this moment in detail. According to her, John didn't cradle JonBenté in his arms as one might expect from a grieving father. Instead, he carried her with his hands beneath her upper legs, holding her body outward and away from him, with her head positioned above his own, almost as if he was distancing himself from her. This posture struck Arndt as cold and unnatural, a stark contrast to the instinctive way most parents would hold a child they just found dead. What troubled her more was how John seemed to know exactly where to go in the house. Despite the basement's wine cellar being a rarely used, hard-to-reach room, and despite the basement's wine cellar being a rarely used, fact that police had yet to fully search that area, John went straight to it. Was it a father's intuition, or did he already know where she was? While these suspicions fueled Arndt's doubts, they remained subjective. No physical evidence conclusively tied John to his daughter's murder, and his actions, while strange, could also be explained as shock and grief, clouding his judgment. But when you look deeper into John Ramsey's role in this case, the picture becomes even more complicated. Many argue that his wealth and social standing in Boulder allowed him to escape the level of scrutiny others might have faced. His influence, combined with the family's standing in the community, seemed to shield him from harsher accusations. Yet, beneath the public image of a composed businessman, several inconsistencies in his statement raised troubling questions. Let's start with the most glaring. Around 1:40 p.m. on the 26th of December, just 40 minutes after finding his daughter's body, Detective Bill Palmer overheard John arranging a flight to Atlanta. His reason? An urgent business meeting. This stunned investigators. Why would a father who had just found his murdered child suddenly prioritize a business trip? Police had already instructed the family to remain in Boulder, making John's attempt to leave seem like either a panicked reaction or an effort to escape questioning. Another strange shift occurred in John's story about the night of the 25th of December. In his initial account to officers French and Arndt, John said that after the family returned from the, quote, White's Christmas party around 10 p.m., he read to John Benton Burke before they went to bed. Yet, months later, John changed his story, claiming John Bent was already asleep when they arrived home. Why the contradiction? Some suspect he altered his story to align with Patsy's or to avoid details that might expose a more troubling timeline. Though there's no proof this change was meant to deceive, the inconsistency cast doubt on his credibility. Suspicion also fell on John's unexplained whereabouts during the morning of the 26th of December. He told police he left the house between 10:30 a.m. and noon to check the mail. But as Detective Arndt pointed out, the Ramsey's mail was delivered directly through a slot in the Ramsey's mail front door, meaning no trip outside was needed. Why disappear for 90 minutes while the house was swarming with police? Some theorize he used this time to dispose of evidence or to coordinate with someone else. Of course, it could have been an overwhelmed man needing time alone, but the unexplained absence fueled further speculation. Finally, conflicting accounts between John and Patsy about who decided to call 911 made the pet timeline even murkier. Patsy claimed she told John she was calling the police, and he agreed while checking on Burke. But in a CNN interview, John told Ted Koppel that after reading the ransom note, which specifically warned against calling authorities, he was the one who told Patsy to dial 911. This discrepancy is significant. Did John want to comply with the ransom note's demands, or did he take control of the situation from the start? Their stories don't match. All these factors, the way he carried John Bent, his immediate effort to leave town, the shifting timelines, the unexplained absence, and the conflicting 911 accounts, don't conclusively prove guilt. But they do paint a portrait of a man whose actions demand closer scrutiny. Whether these inconsistencies reflect guilt, panic, or simply human error in a time of unimaginable stress is something investigators and the public continue to debate decades later. If the ransom note was truly a staged attempt to buy time before John Benny's body was discovered, then the person who called 911 of may have disrupted that plan. John's later claim that he urged Patsy to make the call could suggest he wanted to appear cooperative. Perhaps it reflected genuine panic. But the conflicting accounts between John and Patsy about who made that decision hint at something deeper. A possible breakdown in coordination, exposing cracks in what may have been a shared or individual cover-up. John's story takes another suspicious turn in an April 1997 police interview. He claimed he discovered a basement window open around 10 a.m. on the 26th of December hours, after police had already combed through the home. Instead of reporting it immediately, John said he simply closed the window. But this claim was directly contradicted by Officer Rick French and family friend Fleet White, who both inspected the basement around 6 a.m. and found no open window. Why invent such a story unless you were trying to plant the idea of an intruder? And it's even more questionable considering John himself admitted to having broken that same window months earlier when he was locked out. In the middle of a kidnapping investigation, failing to report an open window isn't just strange, it's almost impossible to explain unless you're trying to shape the narrative. Taken together, John's attempt to flee to Atlanta, his contradictory bedtime stories, his unexplained absence during critical hours, his misleading account of the basement window, and the unclear 911 call timeline all suggest possible efforts to hide involvement, either his own or someone else's. Still, despite all these troubling signs, no hard physical evidence has ever tied John directly to JonBen's murder. And the unidentified male DNA found on JonBen's clothing and under her fingernails DNA that didn't match anyone in the family remains a powerful piece of exoneration. But beyond these lies and contradictions, other unsettling questions surround John Ramsey. One is the autopsy itself. Medical examiners noted injuries on JonBen's body that might have occurred 7 to 10 days before her death, suggesting possible prior abuse. This detail led some investigators to suspect that John, as the head of the household, may have been responsible for that abuse, or at least aware of it. In this theory, JonBen T's murder was an act of desperation to silence her before she could speak out. But again, no DNA or eyewitness evidence ever confirmed that John was responsible for such abuse. In 2008, the family was officially cleared by DNA evidence. Another unresolved clue, reports of fibers allegedly matching the shirt John was wearing that night, found on JonBen's underwear and in her vaginal area. If accurate, this would suggest direct contact during either the crime or an attempted staging. But those fiber matches were never conclusively confirmed in court. Without official verification, they remain speculative, and yet they continue to fuel public suspicion, especially among those who believe John's wealth and influence may have suppressed damaging evidence. Then there's the matter of the basement window. Investigator Lou Smith famously argued that an intruder could have entered through it, but John's story complicates that theory. He had admitted months earlier to breaking the window himself after locking himself out of the window himself. House. And some question why a man with access to his own home and multiple sets of keys would repeatedly use a broken basement window as an entry point. To some, it felt like an excuse designed to support the idea of an outside attacker. Police further undermined the intruder theory by pointing out that cobwebs on the window were undisturbed, suggesting no one, neither family nor stranger, had passed through waiting recently. Some theories now shift the focus from Patsy to John, suggesting that Patsy's role may have been limited to helping cover up what had already happened. In this scenario, John was the primary perpetrator, potentially killing JonBen in an effort to cover up ongoing abuse. Patsy, panicked and loyal, may have written the ransom note to protect her husband and salvage their family's reputation. Fueling these darker theories are rumors of missing CCTV footage from the private airport, where John stored his plane footage that some allege might have shown suspicious activity. Though unproven, these claims have fueled speculation that John used his wealth, private planes, and powerful connections to hide evidence and steer the investigation away from the truth. In the end, what remains is a maze of contradictions and half-truths. John Ramsey stands at the center of this storm, not proven guilty, but never fully cleared in the court of public opinion. Whether he was a panicked father caught in the worst night of his life, or a man hiding something far darker, remains one of the most enduring mysteries in American criminal history. While the questions surrounding John Ramsey's actions continue to fuel debate, the undeniable truth remains. No physical evidence has ever directly tied him to the murder. DNA from an unidentified male found on JonBen's clothing and beneath her fingernails continues to point away from the Ramsey family. And yet, one theory has persisted, one that offers a chilling explanation for the tangled contradictions in this case. This wasn't the product of tabloid sensationalism or amateur speculation. It came from a former CIA analyst and expert trained to detect deception, interpret human behavior, and uncover hidden agendas. According to this theory, John Ramsey orchestrated an elaborate cover-up to protect himself from being exposed for prior sexual abuse against his daughter. He manipulated Patsy and Burke into becoming unwilling players in a staged kidnapping, using them as human shields to deflect suspicion from himself. The theory paints a dark picture of Christmas night, 1996. After the Ramseys returned home from the Whites' Christmas party, Patsy packed for their upcoming trip, while Burke snacked on pineapple in the kitchen. John Bent wandered in and may have taken a piece. Downstairs in the basement, Burke, possibly irritated while playing with his train set, struck John Bent with a blunt object, perhaps the flashlight later found on the kitchen counter. Burke, prone to behavioral outbursts, panicked when she collapsed and alerted Patsy, who, in turn, woke John. Faced with what they believed was a dead child, John allegedly panicked not because of Burke's actions, but because an autopsy might reveal signs of prior sexual abuse, implicating him in a far deeper crime. According to the theory, he devised a desperate plan, stage a kidnapping to buy time, shift focus onto Patsy, and bury the truth before it surfaced. John is said to have instructed Patsy to write the ransom note using household stationery and referencing his $118,000 bonus to make the note traceable to her style and knowledge. Its rambling, theatrical tone reflected Patsy's frantic state, or perhaps what John wanted investigators to perceive as her panicked, confused mind. Meanwhile, John staged further abuse on John Bent's body using one of Patsy's paintbrushes, intending to make the forensic evidence look recent and distract from older injuries. He wiped away his own fingerprints, changed his clothes, and even showered, leaving Patsy's DNA untouched on key pieces of evidence. Then came the final act. Believing they were only staging a crime, John used the garrote made from Patsy's broken paintbrush, but in doing so, accidentally killed John Bent for real. Patsy's horror upon realizing their daughter was truly dead was, according to this theory, the moment the cover-up became irreversible. John knew that dumping the body outside would be too risky, so he hid it in the basement's wine cellar, a room rarely used and easily overlooked. He urged Patsy to call friends over that morning, contaminating the crime scene with their fingerprints and distracting investigators with possible intruder suspects. He approved the placement of the ransom note and pressed for an immediate 911 call, using their planned trip to Michigan as a cover story to explain their sudden rush. During the now infamous 911 call, enhanced audio later picked up what some believe is Burke's voice asking, "What did you find?" suggesting he was awake and aware of the unfolding disaster. John reportedly sent him back to bed to preserve the alibi that Burke had slept through the night. John then handed investigators the very notepad used for the ransom note, casting further suspicion on Patsy. When friends failed to find John Benabate's body, John discovered it himself in the basement, dramatically lifting her into his arms and moving the body, disturbing evidence in the process. This act, investigators noted, conveniently explained why his DNA might be found on her body. John's story was simple. He claimed to have slept through the night, waking only when Patsy screamed. It was an account easy to stick to and hard to disprove. Burke's version matched, suggesting careful coaching. But cracks appeared later when Burke seemed visibly uncomfortable when shown a photo of the pineapple bowl during an interview, hinting at his presence during the events of that night. Patsy, caught between panic and loyalty, struggled to keep her story straight. Her inconsistent statements only deepened suspicion, exactly as John may have intended. The so-called intruder theory, some believe, was never meant to fool the police long-term, but to convince Patsy that she wasn't to blame. And John's plan, if this theory holds any truth, succeeded. He used police missteps and the leniency of a sympathetic district attorney to his advantage. Patsy's sister allegedly removed critical evidence from the home under the pretense of preparing for the funeral, further weakening the case against him. In this theory, John Ramsey's calm, calculated manipulation left Patsy carrying the weight of suspicion, Burke safely shielded, and himself free from prosecution. Unless he confesses, no, definitive link may ever be made between him and John Bent's death. Yet, in the face of growing suspicion and relentless media coverage, the Ramseys did not run. Instead, they assembled a defense team like no other elite lawyers, veteran private investigators, and forensic experts, each carefully chosen not only for their skills but for their loyalty. Among them was Lou Smith, a retired detective known for cracking impossible cases, who would later champion the theory of an outside intruder, giving the Ramseys their most powerful defense yet. Lou Smith wasn't hired to defend the Ramseys blindly. His mission was simple but dangerous: follow the truth wherever it led. While the world dissected every move they made, John and Patsy Ramsey waged a quieter, more personal battle behind closed doors, protecting their lane. Sunburnt from the storm raging outside, his face never filled magazine covers. He didn't sit for interviews. Behind the stained glass windows of their Boulder home, the Ramseys fought to preserve what little innocence he had left. But outside, their silence was mistaken for guilt. Every newsstand, every late-night broadcast screamed accusations. What started as questions became obsessions, whispers of family, abuse, of secret cover-ups, twisted into a public narrative where John and Patsy weren't grieving parents, they were suspects. And yet, John Ramsey did not vanish from sight. Again and again, he stepped into the harsh light of press conferences and television interviews, calm, unyielding, his voice steady, his message clear. I did not kill my daughter. I did not kill John Bent. He didn't plead for sympathy. He demanded the truth. But every appearance cut both ways. To some, he was a father wrongfully accused. To others, he was an expert manipulator, hiding behind polished words and rehearsed composure. In the court of public opinion, his battle had only just begun. As the headlines grew louder and the outrage fiercer, the evidence began to whisper a different story, one built not on emotion, but on cold, quiet science. Forensic testing revealed something no one expected: unidentified male DNA on John Bent's clothing, genetic material that matched neither John, Patsy, nor Burke. In a single lab report, years of speculation were shaken. The medical records told another truth: no signs of prior physical abuse, no evidence of long-term harm within the Ramsey home. And then there was the basement window once dismissed as irrelevant. Beneath it sat a suitcase, positioned as though to help someone climb in or out. It wasn't conclusive, but it hinted at something chilling. Someone may have slipped into that home while the family slept, leaving behind a crime scene that investigators were too blind or too biased to fully see. But perhaps the most damning evidence of all wasn't physical. It was procedural. The Boulder Police Department's investigation was marred by chaos. Friends and family roamed freely before the scene was secured. Rooms went unsearched for hours. Potential evidence vanished before it was ever collected. What once looked like police diligence now seemed like a blueprint for failure. Amidst the wreckage of the investigation, two unlikely figures rose above the noise. Lou Smith, a homicide detective renowned for solving the cases no one else could, joined the investigation, not to protect the Ramseys, but to uncover the truth. He pored over every overlooked detail, tracing the steps of a killer who knew the house well enough to slip in and out unnoticed. Smith saw no impulsive family crime. He saw the work of a predator, cold, calculating, prepared. His conclusion was clear: the Ramseys were not responsible. John Douglas, the FBI's legendary criminal profiler, reached the same chilling end. In his mind, John Bent wasn't killed by a family member, but by someone lurking on the outside, driven by envy, obsession, or revenge. Two independent voices, two paths leading to the same dark place. The killer wasn't in the Argo-Ward house. He was still out there. For the Ramseys, these revelations came too late to repair the damage already done. The public's verdict had long been decided. For years, John Ramsey's face wasn't just a face, it was a symbol. The portrait of a man blamed for betraying the very child he claimed to love. His name had become shorthand for guilt. But as DNA results quietly surfaced, they began to chip away at the foundation of that narrative. It didn't happen with fanfare. There were no breaking news alerts, just quiet lab reports, expert testimonies, and cold clinical facts that didn't fit the story the world thought it knew. And suddenly, The man who had been cast as the villain of America's most infamous child murder began to emerge in a different light, not as a monster, but as something far more human. A father trapped in a nightmare of accusation and loss, still waiting for the world to believe his truth. John Ramsey was no longer painted as the architect of deception, but as something far more complicated, a casualty of a justice system that too often chases headlines instead of truth. He became a symbol of what happens when public outrage replaces due process. In him, many saw every parent judged too quickly, every suspect condemned before the facts were known. The media, once hungry for his downfall, began to shift uneasily. Some quietly acknowledged their mistakes, others simply moved on, leaving their accusations unspoken but not forgotten. But beneath the shifting headlines, the scars remained. Even as the official narrative changed, whispers of guilt lingered in quiet corners of the internet, in late-night conversations, and in the glances of strangers. John Ramsey may have escaped the courtroom, but he could never escape the gray zone between guilt and innocence. In the eyes of the public, he remained trapped forever, the face of America's most infamous unsolved crime. And then, from a place no one expected, the truth began to emerge. Not from a confession, not from a witness, but from the quiet certainty of a DNA lab. On John Bent Ramsey's clothing, beneath the years of speculation and the mountain of rumor, forensic experts uncovered something undeniable: male DNA, foreign, unknown, and most importantly, not John Ramsey's, not Patsy's, and not Burke's. This wasn't another theory. It wasn't a headline spun for ratings. It was fact. Hard, unyielding, irrefutable. In an instant, the narrative changed. For years, people believed the killer had never left the house. But now, the evidence said otherwise. Someone else had been there that night, someone whose identity remained a mystery, but whose presence was written in John Benty's final moments. Science, not speculation, demanded the investigation shift course. But by then, the damage was done. From the very beginning, the investigation had unraveled in slow motion. Before the first light of day touched Boulder's snow-covered streets, critical mistakes were made. The Ramsey home, sprawling, confusing, filled with hidden corners, should have been sealed the moment police arrived. Instead, it became a revolving door. Friends, neighbors, even church members walked in freely, some to comfort the family, others simply to bear witness. But no one stopped them. As hours passed, the crime scene fell apart. Entire rooms went unsearched, including the basement wine cellar where John Benty's body lay undisturbed for hours. Vital evidence, fibers, fingerprints, DNA was lost as people touched surfaces, cleaned dishes, and moved through the home. Investigators missed critical signs: marks on the windows, displaced items, possible entry and exit points. These weren't subtle details. They were flashing neon warnings, and still, they were ignored. By the time police realized the extent of their failure, the scene was hopelessly compromised. The truth wasn't hidden. It was destroyed. And into this disaster stepped Lou Smith. He wasn't hired to protect reputations or clear names. He was brought in to do what no one else seemed willing to do: find the truth. A veteran detective with decades of experience, Smith had solved some of Colorado's most complicated murders. He didn't work through instinct or gut feelings. He worked through evidence, patiently, piece by piece. As he pored over crime scene photos, police reports, and overlooked details, a different picture emerged. To others, the broken basement window was just that, broken. To Smith, it was an open invitation. The suitcase beneath it wasn't random. It was a step for someone climbing through. Scuff marks on the walls, debris on the floor, displaced dust. They told a story few wanted to hear. This wasn't the work of a panicked family member. This was the signature of a predator, someone who knew how to enter, how to move unnoticed, and how to escape. Smith wasn't afraid to share his findings. Standing before cameras, against the tidal wave of public opinion, he spoke clearly and without hesitation. He believed the Ramseys were innocent, not because of their wealth, not because of their social standing, but because the evidence told him so. In Smith's view, the real killer didn't live under the Ramsey roof. He had walked in from the cold, committed an unspeakable act, and vanished, while the World pointed fingers in the wrong direction. And Smith wasn't alone. John Douglas, one of the FBI's most respected criminal profilers, reached a chillingly similar conclusion. His analysis described a killer driven by fixation, by obsession, perhaps by revenge, not someone within the family, but someone lurking in the shadows beyond it. Together, Smith and Douglas stood as voices of reason in a sea of hysteria. Their findings didn't erase the mistakes made, nor did they heal the scars the Ramseys carried. But they offered something the family hadn't had in years: clarity. Yet despite the mounting evidence, the shadow of doubt never fully lifted. In the minds of many, the ghost of that Christmas night still lingered. And in that ghost, John Ramsey was forever trapped. Not a villain, not a hero, but something far more tragic. A father haunted by questions that may never be answered. John Douglas had spent his career stepping into the minds of killers. He wasn't a man easily rattled. As one of the FBI's most renowned profilers, Douglas had mapped the darkest corners of human nature: murderers, kidnappers, predators. He understood the difference between rage and calculation, between impulsive violence and premeditated evil. When Douglas turned his attention to the Ramsey case, he stripped away the noise. He ignored the screaming headlines, the public outrage, and the flawed police theories. He looked only at the behavior, the cold sequence of actions that defined the crime itself. And what he found chilled him. This wasn't a spontaneous outburst of family violence. This wasn't a tragic accident covered up in panic. Douglas saw the fingerprints of something far colder, a predator who harbored deep resentment toward the Ramseys. Someone fueled by jealousy, obsession, or hatred. Someone who had studied them from a distance and chosen their moment to strike with precision. He saw no signs of an emotional, chaotic family murder. Instead, every step of the crime spoke of distance, not closeness, planning, not panic. To Douglas, this was no domestic tragedy. It was the work of an outsider. With clinical certainty, Douglas reached the same conclusion as Lou Smith. The Ramseys were innocent. The killer was still out there. But while investigators moved on and headlines faded, one truth remained as sharp as ever. John Bent's murderer had never been found. For John Ramsey, scientific vindication wasn't enough. The DNA evidence proved his family innocent in the eyes of forensics experts, but it didn't answer the question that kept him awake at night. Who had crept into his home that Christmas night? Who left behind the trace of their presence on his daughter's body? Who had slipped through his house, unseen and untouched, never to be named? As the years passed, the investigation grew cold. Leads dried up. Evidence sat gathering dust in Boulder's archives. The case, once the nation's obsession, became just another unsolved crime. But John Ramsey wasn't ready to let go. He began a quieter battle, one fought not in front of cameras but behind the scenes. He lobbied for advanced DNA testing, urging the use of cutting-edge genetic genealogy that had solved other cold cases. He pressed lawmakers to create new laws, giving families the right to demand independent case reviews when justice stagnated. And in every rare interview, in every carefully chosen public appearance, his message never wavered. This case could still be solved. John Bent still deserved justice, and her killer was still out there. But beneath his determination, a darker question lingered, one that no amount of science could silence. Had the real killer simply disappeared into history, leaving only questions and shadows behind? Would the truth ever be found? Or was this America's great unsolved tragedy forever incomplete? Life after the storm. After the cameras stopped flashing and the headlines moved on, John Ramsey slowly retreated from the spotlight that had consumed his life. The man who once stood before the Gradbulus world, defiant and determined, faded into quiet obscurity. The press conferences ended. The media interviews dwindled. And the public's relentless curiosity turned elsewhere. In the few moments when John did re-emerge in rare interviews or carefully curated documentaries, his message stayed the same. He wasn't seeking sympathy. He wasn't trying to clear his name. He was still fighting for the only thing that mattered, the truth. The killer had never been caught, and his daughter's story was still unfinished. But the years brought more than silence. They brought loss. In 2006, John lost his wife, Patsy, to ovarian cancer. She had been his fiercest defender through the darkest years of public condemnation. Her death left him alone in a way that no courtroom ever could. But this wasn't his first encounter with grief. Years earlier, in 1992, he had buried his eldest daughter, Elizabeth, after a car accident long before John Ben's death shattered his family. Again, tragedy had become a shadow that followed John Ramsey wherever he went. With each loss, his world grew smaller. Friends drifted away, family ties thinned. The voices that once filled his home, whether in laughter or argument, faded into silence. And somewhere in that quiet house, John Ben's bedroom remained untouched. A frozen monument to a little girl whose smile had once lit up every corner of their lives. Holidays passed without celebration. Birthdays came and went, marked only by absence. Grief changed him. The man who had once stood tall against a storm of accusations became quieter, more withdrawn, carrying his burden alone, away from the world's prying eyes. He was no longer the public figure America loved to hate. He was simply a father, haunted by what he couldn't protect and by a question that may never be answered. No longer chasing headlines, John Ramsey faded into the quiet shadows of a life shaped by unbearable loss. He left Boulder, Colorado, a place forever tied to his pain, searching for peace in places where no one whispered his name. For a time, he settled in Las Vegas, a city where secrets blended into the noise, where anonymity was easy to find beneath the neon lights. In 2011, he found companionship again, marrying Jean Rousseau, a fashion designer. Together, they built a life far removed from news cameras and talk shows. He no longer stood before microphones. He stopped giving interviews. But even in this new chapter, the fight never left him. Quietly, away from the public eye, he continued his mission. He supported victims' rights, charities, donated to causes that aided families haunted by unsolved murders, and worked to reform a justice system that had failed him so profoundly. In 2012, he published The Other Side of Suffering, a memoir not fixated on John Ben's murder, but on surviving the grief that followed it. He wrote not as a suspect, but as a father, one who had buried a daughter twice, first Elizabeth in 1992, then John Ben in 1996. And in 2006, he laid to rest his wife Patsy, losing not only his fiercest defender but his closest companion through the storm. Still, Ramsey's focus remained on the case. He believed the answer lay in the science, specifically the DNA left behind by the real killer. He became a tireless advocate for advanced forensic genealogy, urging the Boulder Police Department to embrace the technologies that had solved other decades-old mysteries. But his frustration boiled over as the years passed and nothing changed. His pointed question to investigators, "Do you still have the evidence?" was more than a plea. It was an accusation. To him, their inaction wasn't mere oversight. It was willful neglect, pride masking, incompetence, fear of reopening wounds they never fully understood. He lobbied for legislation to give victims' families the right to demand fresh investigations, ensuring others would never endure the same silence, the same dismissal, the same nightmare. Privately, Ramsey shared his story with families of unsolved homicides. He spoke candidly of the legal obstacles, the public judgment, and the crushing loneliness that comes from being wrongly accused. His voice, though quieter now, carried the weight of hard-earned truth. And yet, even in this quieter life, John Ramsey remained a polarizing figure. To some, he was the father cruelly vilified by a broken justice system and a ravenous media, a man whose life was shattered by assumptions no evidence could support. To others, he remained an enigma, forever linked to unanswered questions and lingering contradictions. A man whose name, fairly or not, was inseparable from the crime. But beneath the theories and suspicions lay something people often forgot. A father who had carried his daughter's body from a cold basement, who had chosen her casket, and who lived every day with her absence echoing through his home. In rare, unguarded moments, his weariness surfaced. You could see it in his eyes. A life not lived, but survived. A man driven not by redemption, but by one final hope, that the DNA left on John Ben's body would one day reveal the truth. The unfinished story, decades have passed, and still, John Ben Ramsey's killer has no name, no face, no arrest. But something else has changed. John Ramsey is no longer widely seen as the villain the media once portrayed. As forensic evidence chipped away at the original accusations, as the failures of the investigation became undeniable, public perception slowly shifted. Today, when his name is spoken, it carries not the sharpness of suspicion, but the weight of understanding. He is seen less as a suspect and more as a victim of a flawed investigation, of a media culture that devoured grief and spat out scandal, of a justice system that mistook tragedy for guilt. But even now, with decades of distance, one question endures, cutting through the noise and speculation, the DNA. It is the last thread of truth in a case buried beneath years of rumors and errors. It has outlived detectives, headlines, and courtroom arguments. And for John Ramsey and for those who still care, it remains the key. The hope for answers now rests in technology that didn't exist in 1996. Forensic genealogy, advanced DNA databases, and cutting-edge sequencing techniques offer the possibility of tracing that unknown genetic code to a name, a face, a past. But science alone won't solve this crime. What's needed is action. The will to re-examine old evidence with new eyes. The courage to confront the failures of the past. Because no matter how far technology advances, it means nothing if those holding the evidence refuse to use it. And until they do, John Ben's killer remains where he has always been, hidden in the shadows, protected by silence, waiting for someone brave enough to finish the story. In the end, after every headline fades, every theory collapses under its own weight, and every investigation runs out of leads, the John Bent Ramsey case leaves us with a single, haunting question. A question no detective has answered. No courtroom has settled. No journalist has silenced. Was John Ramsey nothing more than a broken father, devastated, hollowed out by unimaginable grief, carrying the unbearable weight of loss? Or is there something else? Something still hidden. Something never uncovered. A truth that waits quietly, buried beneath decades of noise and silence, beneath the endless speculation and failed conclusions. It is the question no documentary will ever resolve. It is the question that divides families, investigators, and strangers on the internet to this day. And it is the question that will follow John Ramsey for the rest of his life. The screen fades to a dim, still frame. An older man, worn by time, sits alone in a bare room, shadows stretching long across the bare walls. In his hands, he holds a single photograph, John Ben's smile frozen forever in another lifetime. He does not speak. He does not move. The camera lingers and lingers. No music, no narrator, only silence. And as the screen fades to black, the silence grows louder, filling the space where answers should have been. Because some stories don't end with truth. They end with what remains: doubt, silence, and questions that refuse to die. In the world of unsolved crimes, some cases aren't just puzzles to be solved. They are mirrors. They reflect our darkest fears, that sometimes the innocent look guilty, that sometimes the guilty walk free, and that sometimes the truth is lost forever. John Ramsey's story is no longer just a question of guilt or innocence. It is a story of what happens when a family becomes trapped in a narrative that refuses to let them go. And even after the credits roll, their story continues, quietly, painfully, unfinished. A legacy of change. Yet if there is any light in this darkness, it is this. The John Bent Ramsey case changed the way crimes are investigated forever. The Boulder Police Department's early failures, leaving the crime scene unsecured, allowing friends and family to walk through crucial evidence, and zeroing in on the Ramseys too, soon became a blueprint for what not to do. Those mistakes echoed far beyond Colorado. In their aftermath, police departments across the country re-examined their protocols. Crime. Scenes are now secured faster. Access is limited. Evidence is documented more thoroughly. Modern crime scene guidelines, like those from the National Institute of Justice, emphasize what Boulder overlooked. Preserve first, question later. Interagency collaboration improved, breaking down the walls between local police, the FBI, and forensic labs. Evidence handling became standardized. DNA technology advanced rapidly, pushed forward in part by the unresolved mystery of John Ben's unknown killer. It was this same kind of forensic innovation that eventually cracked cases like the Golden State Killer, solved not by confessions, but by genetic genealogy. The case also taught investigators to beware of tunnel vision, a lesson now embedded in police training nationwide. Today, officers are taught to follow the evidence, not the headlines, and John Ramsey himself helped drive change. Through his advocacy, laws like Colorado's 2013 cold case review legislation were passed, giving families the right to demand new investigations when justice stalls. These reforms, born from tragedy and error, strengthened the foundations of criminal investigations. They made the system more accountable, more precise, and, at least in theory, more just. But even with these advances, one truth remains. John Bent Ramsey's killer has never been caught. The DNA evidence, the final thread in this story, still waits for someone to follow it to its source. It has outlasted police chiefs, journalists, and public opinion. Today, it stands alone as the only undeniable fact in a case clouded by rumor and failure. For John Ramsey, and for many still watching from afar, that DNA is not just a clue. It is hope. Hope that one day, the truth will finally speak louder than the noise. Hope that in some lab, in some database, the name of the person who stole his daughter will finally be found. But that hope depends on something far more fragile than science. It depends on action, on the willingness of those in power to face their failures, open the evidence boxes, and finish what they started. Because no matter how advanced the technology becomes, it means nothing if no one has the courage to use it. And until that day comes, the case remains what it always was: unsolved, unanswered, unfinished.